Okay, everybody, I am on take two for today's news and views from the Nefarium, November 7th, 2013, the year beyond Thunderdome, and I want to get right to it because if you look at this, that's a very thick article. It's the article I want to be talking about, plus another shorter one, both of which were sent to me by Miss Georgianne Hughes of the Bike Show, and I really want to thank her because the first article, the one I really want to concentrate on, is an article dealing with post-Soviet Russia and the rise of President Putin. And it's written by a gentleman who is a Russian himself, an emigre, fought the Soviet system for several years, and then returned to Russia in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he points out, first of all, I want to spend time with this because I believe it's important for you to know what other people are saying. I've been saying all along that President Putin, while he may be authoritarian, and I've had all sorts of people just jumping my case from Eastern Europe, that I've been trying to portray him as something less than authoritarian. No, 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 no. I don't think that President Putin is a throwback to the communist era, nor do I think that he's a throwback to some sort of neo-Stalinism. And the analysis that I've been offering is more or less corroborated by this gentleman, and he raises some points that I think are very important for you to know as we look to Russia and how to interpret what Russia's next moves on the geopolitical scene may be. Now, he starts out by pointing out that in the Western media, Putin has been absolutely excoriated and vilified, and primarily for his treatment of Berezovsky, who is quote-unquote a persecuted businessman in the Western media, or Politkovskaya, who was murdered by KGB goons, Khodorkovsky jailed for his love of liberty, Russia's aggression against Georgia, its genocidal wars against the people in Chechnya, Litvinenko, who was murdered by Putin, and then, of course, the Pussy Riot case, the Russian persecution of homosexuals, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, the Western press has been hammering Russia and Putin in particular for these things, and more recently, of course, offering Edward Snowden asylum. Now, this guy comes right out and says that these things, that the people in Russia, that the vast majority of people in Russia, see these Western portrayals as precisely a smear campaign, and that they do overwhelmingly and popularly support Mr. Putin. But he begins to ask the question, really, what was going on? Where does Putin come from? What does he represent? And in this respect, he takes you back in this article to the immediate post-war, or pardon me, post-Soviet era, post-Cold War years of Boris Yeltsin. And he points out something that very few people in the West realize happened and occurred in Soviet Russia, in post-Soviet Russia, under President Yeltsin. Not the least of which, he says, are the murder by the KGB of over 3,000 people in the Moscow Oblast alone. Now, the Oblast is simply the Russian term for the province or governmental region that the city of Moscow is in. And this was all conducted by the KGB up to the point, however, that Yeltsin lost the support of people in the KGB. The people in Russia were subjected, according to this article, and as we now know, under the Yeltsin regime, to the formation of mafias, to the Western oligarchy in the form of those mafias moving in and starting to carve up Russia. And under this regime, under the Yeltsin regime, the liberals, the so-called liberals, pushed through a constitution that gave tremendous power to the Russian presidency. Now, let me read you what this article says. From 1993 to 1999, A Democratic Nightmare. Quote, after the crushing of opposition by Yeltsin's thugs, the gates of Hades truly opened for Russia. The entire country was taken over by various mafias, and the vast natural resources were pillaged by, parenthesis, mostly Jewish, close parenthesis, oligarchs. The so-called privatization of the Russian economy created both a new class of multimillionaires and many tens of millions of very poor people who could barely survive. A huge crime wave overtook every city. The entire infrastructure of the country collapsed, and many regions of Russia began actively planning their secession from the Russian Federation. Chechnya was allowed to secede from the Russian Federation after a grotesque and bloody war which saw the Russian military backstabbed by the Kremlin. And throughout these truly hellish years, the Western elites gave their fullest support to Yeltsin and his oligarchs. That's a crucial key here to remember. The only exception to this love fest was the political, economic, and military support given by the Anglosphere to the Chechnyan insurgency. Eventually, what had to happen did happen. The country declared bankruptcy in 1998 by devaluing the ruble and defaulting on its debt. Though we will never know for sure, I firmly believe that by 1999, Russia was only a few steps away from completely disappearing as a country and as a nation, unquote. Now, that's crucial because it has long been a geopolitical preoccupation of the so-called Anglosphere. Their greatest geopolitical preoccupation and threat has been precisely Russia, this huge landmass, and how to prevent it from any further expansion and global power. And of course, we know the story of Russia's intervention during the American Civil War on the side of the Union when the Tsar Alexander III sent the Russian fleet to Union waters in response to noises from France and Great Britain that they might get involved on the side of the Confederacy. So this animosity with the Western elite goes back a long time. Now, let me continue from this article because there's something else that you need to be aware of. Quote, panic seized the liberal camp, which ended up committing a huge mistake. This is as Yeltsin begins to decline. They allowed a little-known and rather unimpressive bureaucrat from St. Petersburg to replace Yeltsin as acting president, Vladimir Putin. Putin was a quiet, low-key, competent bureaucrat whose main quality appeared to be his lack of a strong personality, or so the liberals thought. And boy, was that one big miscalculation. As soon as he was appointed, Putin acted with lightning speed. He immediately surprised everybody by becoming personally involved in the Second Chechen War. Unlike his predecessor, Putin gave all the freedom to the military commanders to wage the war as they wanted. Putin then surprised everybody again when he made a truly historic deal with Ahmed Haji Kadyrov to bring peace to Chechnya, even though the latter had been a leader of the insurgency during the First Chechen War. His popularity soared, and he immediately used that to his advantage. In an amazing twist of history, Putin used the constitution developed and adopted by the Russian liberals to implement a very rapid series of crucial reforms and to eliminate the power base of the liberals, the Jewish oligarchs Berezovsky, Khodorkovsky, Friedman, and Gusinski, and so on. He also passed many laws destined to strengthen the vertical power which gave the federal center direct control over local administrations. This in turn not only crushed many of the local mafias who had managed to corrupt and infiltrate the local authorities, it also rapidly stopped all the various secessionist movements inside of Russia. Now, the article then goes on to ask, who then put Putin into power? And the analysis here is very interesting because it concurs with what I've been saying about what Putin represents. He is an authoritarian because he comes out of the KGB. He's coming out of the first chief directorate of the KGB, which, interestingly enough, was that part of the KGB that was concerned with overseas or foreign intelligence operations. It was not the part of the KGB that was concerned with the police state repression that we associate internally to the Soviet Union. And in my opinion, Putin thus represents that part of the KGB that to a certain extent became the repository of the national aspirations and culture of Russia. All right. So in other words, you had a section of the KGB that was in a certain sense less communist than the rest of it. All right. It wasn't concerned with protecting the regime. It was concerned with protecting Russia. All right. Now, that's something to tuck in the back of your mind because we're going to get back to it in a moment. The other two parts of the support behind Putin are coming from what this author calls the Eurasian sovereigntists and the Atlantic integrationists. Now let's listen to what the author says. He says, quote, "The first force was the PGU KGB SSSR, the foreign intelligence branch of the Soviet KGB. Its official name was the first chief directorate of the Committee of State Security of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This would be the rough equivalent of British MI6. This was beyond any doubt the most elite part of the KGB and also its most autonomous one, even though it had its own, and it even had its own headquarters in the south of Moscow. Though the PGU dealt with a number of issues, it was also very closely linked to and interested by the world of big business in the USSR and abroad. Since the PGU had nothing to do with the KGB's most ugly activities, it was not high on the list of institutions to reform, simply because it was not hated as much as the more visible part of the KGB. The second force which put Putin into power was constituted by young people coming from key ministries of the former Soviet Union, which dealt with the industrial and financial issues and which hated Yeltsin's Jewish oligarchs. Unlike Yeltsin's oligarchs, these young leaders did not want simply to pillage all the resources of Russia and later retire in the US or Israel, but they did want Russia to become a powerful market economy integrated into the international financial system. The first group would turn into what I call the Eurasian sovereigntists, while the second one would become the Atlantic integrationists. Now, the Atlantic integrationists are distinguished, in this author's opinion, from the Eurasian sovereigntists by one key factor, in that the Atlantic integrationists want Russia to be integrated into the security and financial arrangements of the West. In other words, almost as if saying Russia were to become a part of NATO. And it is this which Putin, relying on support from the Eurasian sovereigntists, they want to see Russia remain a sovereign entity with its own independent financial system, but closely allied to its geopolitical interests in the Eurasian continent. And that's key, because that's precisely what we see Putin doing. And we must recall in this regard Putin's role, his key role, in the formation of the Shanghai Accords, which has now eventually led to the formation of the BRICS nations. So Putin is coming out of that tradition, but I want to suggest there's one final thing, and that's Putin's Russian orthodoxy. You'll see the undertow in this article of a kind of traditional hostility toward Judaism that comes out of that cultural impetus. I've been suggesting all along that we would gradually see Russia under Putin resume that role of Orthodox protector, all right? I don't think that it will be overt. I think rather you see it manifest in its support for the secular regimes in the Middle East, like Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And we must remember that those regimes, compared to Islamicist regimes, are much more tolerant of their indigenous Christian minority population. So this also, I think, is going to be a leverage to watch. Now, the final point about this article is that the switch between the role internally, the role of culture in the United States and the Soviet Union. And he's pointing out this too, and this is something I've been trying to warn people about, because you're going to see Russia exploit this, and you're going to see China begin to exploit it as well. Listen carefully. Quote, "It is quite amazing for those who remember the Soviet Union of the late 1980s how much the U.S. under Obama has become similar to the USSR under Brezhnev. Internally, it is characterized by a general sense of disgust and alienation of the people, triggered by the undeniable stagnation of a system rotten to its very core. A bloated military and police state with uniforms everywhere, while more and more people live in abject poverty. A public propaganda machine which, like Orwell's 1984, constantly boasts of successes everywhere, while everybody knows these are lies. Externally, the U.S. is hopelessly overstretched and either hated or mocked abroad. Just as in the Soviet days, the U.S. leaders are clearly afraid of their own people, so they protect themselves by an immense and costly global network of spies and propagandists who are terrified of dissent and who see the main enemy in their own people. Add to that a political system which is far from co-opting the best of its citizens, deeply alienates them while promoting the most immoral and corrupt ones into positions of power. A booming prison industrial complex and a military industrial complex which the country simply cannot afford maintaining, a crumbling public infrastructure combined with a totally dysfunctional healthcare system in which only the wealthy and well-connected can get good treatment, and above all, a terminally sclerotic public discourse full of ideological cliches and a completely disconnected from reality. I will never forget the words of a Pakistani ambassador to the UN Conference on Disarmament in Geneva in 1992, who, addressing an assembly of smug Western diplomats, said the following words, quote, "You seem to believe that you won the Cold War, but did you ever consider the possibility that what really happened is that the internal contradictions of communism caught up with communism before the internal contradictions of capitalism could catch up with capitalism," unquote. I would only modify that observation by saying it's not capitalism that the internal contradictions caught up with, it's mercantilism, it's crony capitalism, or as I like to call it, crony capitalism, that begins to show its internal contradictions right now. So in other words, he's drawing the comparison with the former Soviet Union in its days of decline and what is now happening in the West. And I think, folks, that this means, to put it succinctly, that you're going to see a ratcheting up of tensions between the West and Russia and between the West and China. But you're also going to see those nations playing to those internal contradictions for propaganda purposes. And in fact, expect that to happen in a much more intense form than we see now. They're going to exploit the loss of trust in the West, in Western institutions, in Western media, and in the leaders and political parties and institutions of government in the West. They are going to exploit that to the maximum, all right? And justifiably so, I would say. Now, the response to this is another article, a very brief one that I'll link when I get this posted, headed "NATO Prepares for War with Russia." And the article is about a NATO exercise that is going to be held in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. In other words, right on the lap of Russia, right on the key center of Russian culture, that area from St. Petersburg, Novgorod, Staraya Russia, all the way down to Moscow, that cradle of the heart of Russia and Russian culture, all right? They're holding their exercises right there in that region. Now that's very provocative. It's a message, and it's a message of a frightened, please understand this, of a frightened Western oligarchy. The key here is going to be what Russia does now. They are literally the glue that drove the formation of the BRICS alliance. They're the glue kind of holding it together. Expect them to increase the ties among those nations, and expect them not to back down, but to increase their confrontation of the Western oligarchs in places like the Middle East, and more importantly, here it comes, in Europe. I think you're going to see Russia and the BRICS nations making a big play for Germany, and they've already made big plays for Europe. You're going to see them try to woo Europe out of the North American orbit. And the second place I want to predict where Russia is going to try and make a major insertion is going to be in South America. And we see that underway with Brazil and Germany and some of the resolutions they're sponsoring in the UN. We saw it with Putin backing Hugo Chavez in Venezuela by posting Russian naval units in Venezuela, but this is going to increase dramatically. So again, the bottom line here, Putin is, for the Western oligarchs, not a good guy, obviously, but I submit to you he's not the bad guy that Western media is attempting to portray him. He was the one, you'll recall, that stopped the rush for military intervention in Syria. So he's a man to watch, folks. That's it for this week's news and views from the Nefarium, folks. I'll see you on the flip side.